Have you ever walked out of an interview thinking, that wasn't an interview, it felt like an interrogation? I know I have. Over the last few years, I've interviewed with companies in India, Europe, and other parts of the world. And honestly, one thing surprised me. The interview experience could feel completely different. Now, this isn't a video to criticize India, and I'm definitely not saying every interviewer outside India is perfect. These are simply patterns I've personally experienced. And if your experience has been completely different, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. But today, I want to talk about 5 differences I've noticed between many Indian interviews and interviews I've experienced with companies in other parts of the world. One of the biggest differences I've noticed. Many interviews in India can focus heavily on what you already know. Question after question, definition after definition, framework after framework. Sometimes it can feel almost like an examination. And when you don't know one answer, you can almost feel the energy in the room change. Now, compare that with many interviews I've experienced internationally. They weren't only interested in what I knew. They wanted to understand how I think, how I solve problems, how I approach uncertainty, how quickly I learn, and how I would deal with something I hadn't encountered before. Because let's be honest, nobody knows everything. Technology changes, businesses change, markets change. The real question isn't always, what do you know today? Sometimes it should be, how capable are you of learning tomorrow? This one surprised me the most. Whenever I genuinely didn't know something, I said, I haven't worked on that. Or, I don't know enough about it to answer confidently, because I believe honesty builds trust. But in some Indian interviews I've experienced, I felt that honesty could immediately reduce my credibility. Almost like, oh, she doesn't know this. Whereas with some international interviewers, the response was completely different. They became curious. They'd ask, okay, how would you learn it? Or, if you had to solve this tomorrow, where would you begin? And honestly, I loved those questions. Because they weren't testing whether I could memorize an answer. They were testing my mindset. And there's a big difference between the two. This is probably the biggest emotional difference I've felt. Some interviews felt like the interviewer had already formed an opinion. The body language, the tone, the facial expressions. Everything made me feel like I was constantly being judged. Instead of feeling like two professionals having a conversation, it felt like I was trying to prove my worth. On the other hand, many international interviewers I've interacted with created a very different atmosphere. They listened, they smiled, they allowed silence. They encouraged discussion. And because of that, I actually performed better. Not because the questions were easier, but because I felt psychologically safe enough to think. And that's something interviewers sometimes underestimate. When someone is nervous, you may not be seeing their actual capability, you may simply be seeing their anxiety. Another thing I've noticed, sometimes interviewers aren't necessarily looking for the best answer. They're looking for their answer. And if your thinking is different, it can almost feel like you're wrong. But here's the problem. Innovation doesn't happen when everyone thinks exactly the same way. Some of the best interview conversations I've had were with people who responded, interesting, I hadn't thought about it that way, or simply, tell me more. That one sentence can completely change an interview, because suddenly you're not defending yourself, you're thinking together. And isn't that exactly what you want from someone you'll eventually work with? I genuinely believe this is one of the most important qualities an interviewer can have. Knowledge matters, experience matters, technical skills matter, but emotional intelligence matters too. The ability to make someone feel comfortable, the ability to listen, the ability to ask difficult questions without making someone feel small, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to understand that there is a human being sitting across the table. A person who may have spent weeks preparing, a person who may have already faced several rejections, a person who may have recently lost their job, a person who may be dealing with financial pressure, or simply someone who is having a terrible day. And here's something I wish more interviewers understood. Not every nervous candidate is an incapable candidate. Sometimes they're just human. Now, before anyone gets offended, let's talk about why I think some of these differences exist. India has one of the world's largest talent pools. Thousands of candidates can compete for the same role. Interviewers are often under enormous pressure. Many interviewers were themselves interviewed in the same way years ago. So naturally, the cycle continues. But I genuinely believe things are changing. Organizations are becoming more global. Younger leaders are entering management. Companies are paying more attention to candidate experience. Slowly, but it is changing. And conversations like this can part of that change. Before I end this video, I'd like to say something, not just to Indian interviewers, but to interviewers everywhere. Please remember, the person sitting across from you is not just another candidate. They are someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's parent, someone who may have just gone through one of the most difficult phases of their career. Today, many people are interviewing because they've been laid off. It doesn't just affect their income, it can affect their confidence, their sense of identity. So if a candidate seems nervous, please don't immediately assume they're not capable. Try to understand why. Look beyond that 1 hour. Look at the years they've invested in their career. Look at the impact they've created. Look at the challenges they've overcome, because one interview can never capture the full story of a person's abilities. The best interviewers don't just evaluate answers, they understand people. Sometimes, the most talented candidate in the room isn't the person who speaks perfectly. It may be the person sitting quietly across from you, trying to rebuild their confidence. And that person deserves empathy. Because interviews shouldn't just measure competence, they should also reflect humanity. So if you're an interviewer watching this, I hope your next interview isn't just about finding the best resume. I hope it's about discovering the person behind that resume. Because kindness costs nothing, but for someone who's trying to rebuild their career, it can mean everything. And sometimes, the way you treat someone during their hardest chapter is something they will remember. These are my experiences. Yours may be completely different, and that's absolutely okay. The purpose of this video isn't to divide people. It's to start an honest conversation about how we can make interviews better. So I'd love to know, have you noticed a difference? Share it in the comments. And if you enjoy honest conversations about workplace psychology, subscribe to The Corporate Lady. Understand people, grow yourself, navigate work life.